Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. This is Neil with Portal to Ascension, portaltoascension.org. Thank you all for tuning in. Very excited today for today's guest, today's topics. This is going to be most likely, we're going to go with the flow. I have some questions for Paul Wallis as our guest today. And this most likely may be three different segments because of the depth of information there is. And we'll see how everything flows. And Paul Wallis, his information, his books, and specifically today, we're going to be speaking about the Eden Conspiracy, which is the book that I've been reading from Paul Wallis, and I've had him on the platform a few times. But first of all, for all of you who do not know who Portal to Ascension is, my name is Neil. I'm the founder. We started in 2008 with events around the US and Canada, sound healing events that ultimately went into ancient alien all-day conferences at Unity churches around the US by 2011, and quickly morphed into events on a range of conscious topics, a lot of ancient history, a lot of extraterrestrial awareness, and of course, consciousness, spirituality, meditation. But the real milestones in our creation were of information on extraterrestrial awareness, our galactic connection and ancestry, and the historical aspect, which combines together. Some people call this ancient aliens, which is only one part of really looking at the bigger picture, which is why it's amazing that I'm having a conversation today with Paul Wallis, because it's what was our moment of inception, if you will, with Portal to Ascension, on what really sparked the awareness of the consciousness for us to even get to this point today. Paul Anthony Wallis is an internationally best-selling author whose books probe the world mythologies and ancestral narratives for the insights into human origins, human potential, and our place in the cosmos. A popular speaker and researcher, his documentaries and collaborations are watched by millions. As a senior churchman, Paul served as a church doctor, a theological educator, and archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia, with numerous titles published on Christian mysticism and spirituality. His books, Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, Echoes of Eden, The Eden Conspiracy, and The Invasion of Eden, are endorsed by Eric von Daniken, Laura Eisenhower, George Norrie, and hailed by George Norrie as this generation's chariots of the God. Paul is the go-to guy in the field of Paleo Contact. And Paleo Contact, everybody, means the contact with beings from the stars, otherworldly beings, called extraterrestrials, with humans on Earth. So Paleo Contact, our original contact, inception of what occurred for humanity to be here. He's the host of the popular YouTube channel, The Fifth Kind, and also the Paul Wallis channel. And we've had Paul here multiple times on Portal to Ascension.
Thanks for having me again. It's great to be with you. Well, in the Eden series, I really am sharing my own journey of discovery. Each book can stand on its own, but you will certainly be tracking my journey of unlearning and relearning and reframing if you read them in the order that I wrote them. So to give you that quick synopsis, Escaping from Eden, really the reader meets me in that moment when my whole worldview is going into the blender as a result of probing anomalies in the stories we tell from the Bible. Now, my start point was in Christian ministry, and I'd been preaching from the Bible for 33 years. I'd been training pastors in hermeneutics, which are the principles of interpretation, for 15 years. So I was very familiar with these anomalies, but had never really pursued them from the perspective of translation. What do the words really mean? If they're anomalies, it means there's something I'm not understanding about the stories themselves, their origins, their roots, so on and so forth. And when I went to those texts with all the tools that I'd been providing to my pastors in training, I discovered that the glitches really were to do with translation. And that when I pursued the root meanings of the key words, the story that emerged wasn't some randomly altered story. It was a totally different story, a summary form of the stories of origins from out of ancient Mesopotamia. So very quickly, I realized the biblical stories are a restatement of the stories from out of ancient Sumer, Babylonia, Acadia, and Assyria, and that many of our familiar God stories are really restatements of ancient stories about sky people. They're not religious texts in original form. They're not stories about God in their original form. They are stories about paleo contact, our ancestors' contact with visitors from elsewhere in the cosmos. And some of those visitations were happy ones where the development of humanity was supported, and some of those visitations were less happy where essentially we were being colonized. And so Escaping from Eden shows how the paradigm shifts when you go to a more fundamental translation of the biblical texts. So it asked the question, was the human race created by God or engineered by ETs? And at the end of Escaping from Eden, the reader will be realizing, it looks like we had some external interventions here. The Scars of Eden is the next book, and it answers the question, so what? What difference does it make if we were created by God or engineered by ETs? What difference does that make in terms of how we live our lives, how we understand our world? And are there marks other than narrative marks on human history to indicate one way or the other? And in the Scars of Eden, I say, yes, there's a lot about how this world works that has its roots in ancient experiences of colonization. And then in Echoes of Eden, by the time I'm writing that book, I've realized that the cultures that have best curated the memory of ancient contact are also cultures that have thought through the implications. A different story of origins creates a different expectation for human potential. And so I sit down with indigenous leaders, people who are the curators of knowledge in cultures informed by traditional initiation. And I ask those questions. Who are we? What are we capable of? And Echoes of Eden ask the question, what secrets of human potential were buried along with our ancestors' memories of ET contact? By the time we've reached the end of Echoes of Eden, the reader will be thinking, wait, just a minute. So if the Bible wasn't originally about God, what was it about? If those stories weren't really God's stories, what was the point of those scriptures in their earliest form? And in the Eden Conspiracy, I find the Bible to be full of lessons, not only to do with human potential at an individual level, but lessons about human progress, lessons about grassroots power, lessons about how we can shift our mentality as a species and have a better experience moving forward than our ancestors have. So it asks, what were the secrets that our ancestors wanted us to know? And I find that in the Bible, the whole process of narrative control and narrative shift in which ancient Judaism went through this reform and changed from being a memory of contact and an empowering view of humanity to a monotheistic view and a view of humanity in which our only role is essentially to do as we're told, pay, pray, and obey. That whole narrative control, the seizing of control, the changing of the narrative is tracked openly in black and white in the pages of the Bible in a way that Christianity has largely ignored for 2,000 years. So I lay that all on the table in the Eden Conspiracy. And then in The Invasion of Eden, my latest book, I bring all those insights to the question of, well, what's happening right now? Last year, we had this extraordinary conversation between military intelligence and the US Congress concerning contact in the present and what it means. Are we facing an existential threat in terms of our contact in the present day? Every 6 weeks, the operations of US defense are interfered with, on average, by close encounters. That was the official rate in the white paper that was published for the Senate to read back in 2021. So what are we looking at? Should we be excited about those who are in contact with us today? Should we be excited by all the close encounter phenomena around the world? Are we looking at another potential leap forward for humanity? Or should we all fear for our lives? What did our ancestors have to say? How do they inform how we approach these questions? And that's where we've reached with The Invasion of Eden.
Right. So from my understanding, Abraham, let's go back to the root of the Abrahamic religions, right? Abraham was from the city of Ur of Chaldeans, right? And as far as I know, Ur was a city in Sumer, a Sumerian city. So there, just right in the root text of the Abrahamic scriptures in the Old Testament, we already have the connection to Sumer and Mesopotamia. So could you kind of paint a picture? And let's go up until around 6th to 7th century BCE, which is the monotheization, I believe, of Judaism. So what was Abraham? When did this occur? And then if you can take us into when Moses occurred, what happened with Moses, and what the connection is with Egypt and Sumer, because we see a lot of connections, obviously, with Sumer, but then we also see the fact that the Jews were in Egypt and took a lot of information from the Egyptians, including some people say the 12 commandments became the 10 commandments. So could you kind of start by painting a picture for us of this timeline?
Well, to go back to Abraham, when we read the Bible today, I would suggest we're reading a number of stories that have been fused to give the appearance of a single story. In the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you've got a whole sequence of stories of beginnings that have been placed alongside each other. And in their current form, they've been edited to look like it's a continuous story, with a beginning, middle, and an end. I would suggest that's not the case at all. We've got separate stories of beginnings that have simply been placed in a library together, so that you've got a story about the rehabilitation of planet Earth in Genesis 1. It's not a creation story. The planet already exists right at the beginning of that chapter. It exists before the sun, moon, and stars. So some question marks should be flying up as soon as we realize that. We're looking at a planet that's been devastated. The Hebrew phrase is tohu wa bohu. It's been devastated, destroyed, it's in chaos, and it needs rehabilitating. And the powerful ones, the Elohim, turn up and rehabilitate it. It is a flood story, one of 3 flood stories in those early chapters. 2 flood stories have been fused together in Genesis 6. You've got 2 stories about the creations of human beings. You've got a story about an upgrade of human beings. You've got a story about the separation of nations, separation of the lands, separation of the continents, a story about the destruction of a society that's about to go spacefaring, and our cosmic neighbors don't want a spacefaring planet Earth, so we get bombed back into a pre-Stone Age condition. By that point, you're in Genesis 11. And conventionally, people think that's where the stories of beginnings end. And we then get into the story of the modern world with Abraham and Sarah. I suggest in the Eden conspiracy and in the invasion of Eden that Abraham and Sarah is also a human origins story. So we're familiar with it in its current redaction as the beginning of the story of the Hebrew people and the Jewish people. However, a couple of clues that something else is going on. Abraham and Sarah, those names find a curious parallel in the Vedas of Hinduism, which talk about Brahma and Saraswati as the progenitors of the human race. Now, if you take the vowels out of Abraham and Sarah, you'll quickly realize they are the same names. Swati is a suffix that means beautiful, so you really do have Brahma and Sara. And without the vowels, you can see it's the same name from one telling to the next. In the Hindu telling, they are the progenitors of humanity, and the Bible describes Abraham and Sarah as the progenitors of many nations. I suggest they are the progenitors of the many nations, and that we've got a story of human origins sewn in to a later story. Another little clue that this might be a much, much older narrative is when you get further on from Genesis 12, and you realize that 2 generations thereafter, you're looking at 2 different kinds of human being washing around in the text. A smooth-skinned type of person who is not as strong physically, but very wily. And then an earlier model, taller, stronger, covered in hair, so thick that the hair is indistinguishable from the skin of a goat. And the smooth-skinned person learns to manipulate the hairy kind of person, through offerings of food. Now, it's told as the story of brothers, but that's not a story of brothers. That's how we tame wild animals. And it seems to me that's a recollection of a time when our smooth-skinned ancestors were working out how to become the alpha species and dominate the environment when there were more powerful hominids on the earth and other kinds of being besides. Another little clue that the stories of human origins roll further into the Bible than we might have originally thought. Now, Abraham and Sarah are not fertile because of their age, according to the story. They only produce this new line of humanity after a close encounter with beings that when they turn up, Abraham and Sarah think they are just three people. But by the end of the story, we realize these were not just three people, these were advanced beings. Two of them move on from there to Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're clearly so beautiful, so extraordinarily attractive, that it would be like Harry Styles walking through an airport, or Justin Bieber a few years ago, and getting that kind of reaction from the people. And the evidence that they are a bit more than just attractive other people is the fact they have the power to nuke two cities just like that. So that's the Abraham and Sarah story. That's why I think we need to read it at a number of levels. Yes, it's told as the beginning of the story of the Hebrew people, but it's a human origin story that's far, far older. And in The Invasion of Eden, my latest book, I dispute the idea that they come from Lower Mesopotamia. I argue they came from ancient Armenia. Ur of Haldi is up in ancient Armenia, up in modern-day Turkey. And the place names strongly suggest that's where they came from, that they did a walk from there to Haran, which is only 250 kilometers away, different Haran to the one that's been conventionally thought of. And they moved because the Elohim, the powerful ones in the plural, told me in the plural to leave. That's what Abraham said. And he was leaving beautiful country I was in last month. It's a place that makes sense for Abraham to emerge from, because that's where his ancestor lived, his ancestor Noah, who landed in ancient Armenia on the Mount of Ararat after the Great Deluge. And we have local stories in that part of the world also identifying that as the place where Noah's family resided. And so Armenia, Turkey, the Van province, they look to their god Haldi. This is the Ur of Haldi, the high place of Haldi, from which Abraham left. They look to their ancient progenitor Haik, who was a great-grandson of Japheth, son of Noah. All these narrative traditions point to that part of the world. And there are other reasons why we look to there as evidence of a reboot in the human story. We see the origins of farming. We see the origins of the Iron Age. Classical writers from ancient Greece and Rome say that is where the Iron Age began. It's a place of one of the most ancient languages on the planet. And so I think there are a lot of unanswered questions around the stories of Abraham. I'm going to continue my research in the Van province and adjacent areas, because I do believe that's where we saw a reboot, and the stories of Abraham relate to that.
And then we have Göbekli Tepe in that area too, that's changing the timeline in many levels.
It really does. That's right. I mean, if you look around the Van province today, you'll find some very interesting archaeological sites. And the conventional story is that the history of those sites, those high places, go back to the 8th century BCE. But you don't have to travel too far before you're looking at a megalithic society that was coming towards its close 10,000 years ago, and building very impressive structures out of rock. And so the idea that the earliest buildings in the Van province were in the first millennium BCE, it leaves too big a gap. And I think the story goes much, much deeper than we've yet managed to excavate.
In the story, he had to repopulate the planet. And that's a whole other story, because obviously in the story of Gilgamesh and his tribe was around, and they ran into Noah. So maybe there was another tribe on the planet at the time that were hybrids of some sort. But then you said the Abraham story, which comes after Noah, is also another seeding. So is there a timeline on this? Like, what did Noah's flood happen 13,000 years ago, the Younger Dryas, or maybe earlier than that?
Very possibly earlier. As I say, there are at least 3 flood narratives in Genesis 1 to 11. They're not necessarily all the same flood. And I think it's difficult to produce a really definitive timeline when the timelines have already been muddled before the stories have been told that we're familiar with. So, I just wouldn't be too confident putting years and dates on Abraham and years and dates on Noah and thinking that we really are looking at some neatly ordered sequence. I think it's more mysterious than that. And you're right to point out, hang on, but there are other populations in the story. People pick this up in reading the book of Genesis, when Cain goes out from the safe enclosed zone. He's thrown out because he's killed his brother. He's frightened of the other people he's going to come across. So, well, who are the other people? Or if we follow the Norse stories of the Aesir, if we listen to Snorri Sturluson writing in the 1200s, he says that Odin came from close to the Van province in Turkey, in ancient Asaland, as he called it, ancient Armenia. And those advanced beings, so advanced that Odin and his mates could just walk into Northern Europe and Scandinavia, carve it up, give different bits to his sons without any difficulty at all. They're so advanced. And yet they're having quite a peer-to-peer stoush with their neighbors in the mountains around Ararat. And the Vanir are their neighbors, who are sort of portrayed as not good people because they're the enemy. And then the Aesir are the ones who become the gods in the Norse story. So who were the Vanir? And why were they so advanced in that part of the world? And I think the answer does fit with the idea that there was a reboot and an externally assisted reboot in that part of the world. So to reintroduce agronomy, civil engineering, technologies to get humanity moving again. Clearly, the people living where that's happening, several generations down the line, are going to have enough of an edge that they can start moving out from there and exporting themselves into other lands. And I think that's what we're looking at.
And let's say that a lot of people think that the flood, the Great Flood, Younger Dryas time, was the story of Noah and the story of the fall of Atlantis. If Abraham came after that, that would be almost like another seeding within the last 13,000 years. And we have a good record of at least 7,000 to 8,000 years of our history, right? So, and when we
remember, Abraham is many stories. That's my belief. So Abraham, yes, one layer of it could definitely be in that time frame. So the reboot after the Younger Dryas Cold period. But that's it that leads to 2 different kinds of human. It sounds to me like a much, much older story from an earlier reboot and an earlier intervention that might go back a couple of 100,000 years. But they've all been stitched in together into the Abraham story.
And that would make sense because the story of the Sumerian scriptures and the Anunnaki, they're dating those stories back to 200,000 years before them, and they existed around 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. And it's interesting that they're even using their own city names, Uruk, in stories that they're saying were like 150,000 years before they even existed.
Yes, that's right. So, I mean, there's every possibility that their great cities were built on the foundations of other cities, the ones in their ancient stories. And people forget that when we go back to ancient Sumeria and we hear their stories about the Anunnaki, they are telling stories about what was already the deep past. And when you get to the King's List, you're quite right. We're going back more than 200,000 years for the roots of some of these stories. So we're looking at interventions in the human timeline as far back as that. And then we're looking at other interventions after the Younger Dryas Cold period within the last 10,000 years. And in my latest book, The Invasion of Eden, I follow the white rabbit of dragon story around the world, which Julien Duy of the Sorbonne has done a wonderful study on this, and he relates the patterns of dragon story around the world to what we know about human migrations, and shows that there are two waves of story. One wave of story that's at least 175,000 years old, talks about an intervention to elevate the human experience. And then another wave of story that's within the last 10,000 years that sounds a little bit more like a hands-on colonization and more detailed tutelage in how to build cities and manage dense populations. And I found it very interesting coming across those two ways of story, because it correlates with what I found in other non-dragon stories that suggest interventions at those different times. So I think we've been visited, colonized, assisted, exploited, tutored many, many times through our emergence as the human species. And our stories have pulled together fragments of those memories and then sort of glued them together in a mosaic-like form to present the stories with which we're familiar. So when we go to those stories, we can't, I don't think, read them as if we're reading diary entries, you know, what happened from year to year. It really is a pastiche of human experience that goes back far, far into the mists of time.
Yeah, I agree. It's many different stories combined. It's poetry, creativity, and literal facts all put in one, it seems. Would you agree?
Yes, I agree. I think that's right. The pattern of the Moses and Yahweh story falls very precisely into the pattern of dragon story that is 10,000 years old. So I think that layered into those stories are memories from that time frame. Now, to be honest, I haven't looked into how to correlate the timeline implied by the stories of Moses with the law of ancient Egypt. Other people have done work on that and come to different conclusions about how you match them together, but that's not something I've really probed, so I'm not going to be able to help you with dates on that one.
Okay, so when we have the Moses story, and then it seems from what I've learned from you is that before 7th century BCE, that Judaism, or maybe it wasn't even called that at that point, was actually a polytheistic religion, had multiple powerful ones that they were worshiping. And
Yes.
so would you say that maybe in the story of Moses, because when we see movies, we see Moses stories, we're talking about the Jews and how they're enslaved by Egypt. Do you have any information on, was there a slavery happening in Egypt to the Jews? And from what I'm piecing together with your information, I'm thinking that there were a whole other religion or dogma or had a whole different ideology that maybe later became Judaism.
Yes, that's right. I think the story of Moses and the Exodus is framed for us in a world of polytheism if we read Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82, because there we have the story of the invasion and the parceling out of lands to different Elohim, to different powerful beings. So the Hebrew scriptures talk about the arrival of the Tseva Hashemayim, that's the sky armies or the airborne armies. They arrive, they form the El Ba'adat, that's the council of power, and the being who's chairing this process, who's known by the title El Elyon, which simply means the powerful one, higher than the other powerful ones. He portions out lands to different Elohim, and the Elohim own the land, the minerals in the land, the fauna on the land, and the human beings on the land. And among those Elohim is a being who goes by the name of Yahweh, and he is clearly a junior member of the El Ba'adat because he gets a people group with no land. His people group are on the land of Egypt, belonging to the Elohim by the name Acher. And so when we're introduced to Yahweh in the Moses story, his first task is to go to Achech's land and notice the phonological similarity of those names. Yahweh, Achech. They are counterpart Elohim, which becomes very clear in the book of Joshua at a later stage in the story when Joshua says to the people, decide who you're going to serve, Achech or Yahweh. Same kind of service, same kind of entity. So Yahweh has to go to Egypt and get his people group out of Egypt, and then he has to fight with other Elohim in order to get land for his human beings to live on. El Elyon has created this artificial scarcity, ensuring that the Elohim are going to be conflicting with each other. And the whole of the story of Yahweh and his people group, that's what frames it. That's why they're always in conflict. That's why they always feel like they're the underdog and having to kill and slaughter people in order to get possession of land. That's why Yahweh is so keen on presenting himself as a man of war. His other name is the powerful one, the destroyer, and he goes about proving himself worthy of that name. So that's what frames those stories. Yahweh comes along, he gets his people, and then he creates the laws by which they're going to be governed and creates the people structures by which they're going to be managed. And that whole system fits absolutely squarely in the world's canon of dragon narratives. So that's the framing of the Moses story. And really you can tell the story of Moses / Yahweh absolutely in parallel. So when Jesus comes along and starts dismantling the place of Moses, he's also, by the same token, dismantling the place of Yahweh and replacing those laws with his own teachings. They have to invade other people's land. They have to slaughter other people in order to get them.
Right. What do you think about when Moses went up to Mount Sinai and he received the 10 Commandments? He came down and his people, or a lot of his people, were worshiping the bull, what he considered pagan. But from my understanding, it was a shift in the zodiac, and every new religion on the planet happens at a shift in the zodiac. And I believe they were worshiping Taurus, right? And so, this is very interesting because now I'm drawing connections to you, actually. So worshiping Taurus, and then he obviously creates this earthquake, people fall in, that's this conventional story. Was it that they were worshiping the old zodiac and they just weren't used to the new one? And is there a Palladian connection there because of the bull?
Yes, I think there is a Pleiadian connection because there is a theme through the Hebrew scriptures of Yahweh being very upset by this Pleiadian connection. And it plays out in a couple of ways. So first of all, you've got the worship of the bull, which could very well be the commemoration of beings who came from the Pleiades and helped their ancestors in the deep past. And the entity who is most commonly named in that context in the Hebrew scriptures is Asherah, a female being who came from the Pleiades and taught their ancestors how to farm and become a civilization. And she was remembered with great affection for her impact on the ancestral story. Commemorations would be made to Asherah. Every harvest festival, they would thank Asherah. They would carry handheld figurines of Asherah, and they would create all kinds of food from corn to give thanks for what Asherah taught them. And Yahweh couldn't stand this. And the priests of Yahweh couldn't stand it. So when you get into the reforms of Judaism, when there were Yahweh's kings on the throne in the 8th to 6th century BCE, they tried to obliterate the memory of Asherah and disband all the priesthoods of Asherah and Dagon and Milcom and Chemosh, demolish the temples, break the horns off the altars, slaughter the priesthoods at times, so that there will be no option but for the Jewish people to worship the only one remaining deity, the one worshipped by the king, and that's Yahweh. And the jealousy of Yahweh towards Asherah is something powerful as you read those texts. And so I do think the people were doing something ancient. They'd gone back to something very familiar in essentially commemorating those who had helped them in the past. When we read it today, We read it all through the lens of the Ten Commandments. We read it through the lens of monotheistic Judaism and think that we're reading about idolatry or something very wicked, whereas in fact it was a very positive memory that the people were treasuring. And Jeremiah tells us that they remembered their time of direct governance under Yahweh as a very negative experience. Jeremiah says the people spoke disparagingly about Yahweh and had put all his laws to one side. Thank you very much. And Jeremiah, of course, thinks this is very bad. And so he tells us all this information about their ancient memory and their ancient memory of Yahweh, and then adds his little PS, isn't that awful? And so the reader feels they have to agree with the isn't that awful. But the moment you separate the narrator's opinion of what was going on from the information, you realize we've just been told in the beginning, Judaism was a canon of Paleo Contact, was a cultural memory of contact with helpful beings as well as others who were more violent. And Yahweh was right at the more violent end of the spectrum.
I don't feel the exact story of Moses coming down, putting the clay tablets on the ground, earth opens up and they get swallowed up. I'm not sure if it happened exactly like that, but it seems that they converted and became full-on Jews and full-on murderers of people in Phoenician lands, right? Later on when they started invading Jericho and different places. So did Yahweh, is this a story, Moses' story, a story of Yahweh beating these people into submission? That basically with fear, with starvation, with the sun in the desert, with the fact that it took them 40 years to find the promised land, is this all stories of them being kind of brainwashed and then a generation dying off and then another generation being brainwashed into the new canon?
Correct. And I think there are many moments that confirm that. Let's give a couple. A moment from Ezekiel and a moment with the Nehushtan in the desert. So this is the moment where they've been in the wilderness for some time. They've been living on emergency rations of manna, a word which essentially means we don't know what this is. And they were getting fed up. This was like wartime privations for 2 generations. And when they complain to Moses, Yahweh's response is to send in fiery serpents, whatever they were, to bite the people and make them ill. And their only hope of recovery was if they would bow down to the Nehushtan. And the commands that Yahweh has already given about images and the forced forgetting of other powerful ones makes very clear this is an image of himself. They have to bow down to if they want to recover. So yes, punished, beaten into submission. Another, for instance, comes in the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is shown what these amazing advanced weapons can do. The human-like being that is described in Ezekiel, who has flown Ezekiel around in this ruach, this kavod, the being shows him that 6 individuals equipped with either a keli mashito or keli mapaso can ethnically cleanse an entire district. And what they're looking for is this: any family that will not make a public show of grief over carvings in the temple showing what the Tzeva Hashemayim looked like, showing all the beings of the airborne armies. If they don't show open grief that those carvings are there, then you incinerate them with these weapons. Because again, Yahweh wanted the people to forget that there ever were other advanced beings. There was only him. And of course, it's enshrined in the 10 Commandments. You will have no other powerful ones before me. Do not bow down to them. Do not serve them. Do not even depict them. It's this forced forgetting. It's this taking control of the narrative. There's only one powerful one, and his name is Yahweh, and he's a man of war, and he won't tolerate any other powerful one because he's a jealous, powerful one. That's the story. And in fact, he's so jealous. There's a story in which one of his kings, one of his successors, a human king, is mortally ill. He's broken his back. He doesn't know if he's going to recover or if he's going to die. And so he sends for a prognosis to the Elohim down the road, the Elohim of Ekron. And when Yahweh hears about this, so his prophet says, he's so furious that he pronounces the death sentence over the king. And he says, is there not an Elohim here? Pointing to himself, that the king has to go off to the Elohim of Ekron, the Lord of the Flies, he says, changing his name by one letter. So that story is told so that people will know they mustn't have anything to do with other Elohim, only with Yahweh. And so we're going from a place of Paleo Contact to polytheism to henotheism, which is where you acknowledge other powerful ones, but you serve only one. And then from the 8th century to 6th century, the whole narrative is shifted so that the other powerful ones only remembered as handheld devices or statues. And the whole idea that there were other beings gets buried so that the figure of Yahweh can morph into an almighty and unrivaled God. Except the changing of the narrative is told us openly in the books of Jeremiah, 2 Kings, and Ezra. So we know the story was changed.
We're going to close out this segment in a moment here. We're going to get into part 2, 8th to 6th century BCE, which will be part 2, and we'll go deeper into the Elohim. But as you're speaking, I'm realizing that it's kind of ironic that when Moses was up on Mount Sinai, he got a commandment, do not worship any other powerful ones. And as soon as he came down, that's exactly what they were doing, worship another powerful one, you know? And then when they got to Israel, it seems it didn't work. It didn't work telling them not to worship any other powerful ones, because what we're going to speak about in the next segment, 8th to 6th century BCE, they were still worshiping the other powerful one, and Yahweh was losing credibility. So even though they tried to wipe it out, it seemed that they still continued to worship other ones. And maybe that's got to do with when they came to the promised land, there were other powerful ones in that area that they also adopted into their own beliefs.
That's right. And of course, none of these stories make sense if you think when you read the word Yahweh, you're reading about God. Why on earth would people worship smaller beings in preference to Almighty God? It doesn't make any sense. Or if you get to 1 Samuel 8, how could they possibly think they could sack Almighty God and replace him with a human king? These stories only make sense when you realize Yahweh was one of a number of Elohim, was one of the El Ba'adat, was one of the Tseva Hashemayim. Only then do you understand why there is this rivalry and this jealousy, and why the people would hold on to their ancient memories. And it's something I can relate to very directly through having visited Brazil in the 1980s and seen the Roman Catholic Church attempt to obliterate cultural memory, which was all about thanking powerful beings who helped us in the deep past and replacing it with Roman Catholicism, and trying to get rid of the handheld figurines that were still being used in ceremony in the 1980s and replace them with Catholic ceremonies. It's exactly the same struggle in the modern era as we see in the pages of the Bible.
Wow. Really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Paul. And we'll be back, everybody, for part 2, and we'll have part 3 as well. And in part 2, we're going to go even deeper. So this was kind of a historical context taking us up to a shift. A huge shift occurred on the planet, actually, around 8th to 6th century BCE. And we're going to go into what occurred then, what the shifts were, and then go deeper into who the powerful ones are. So, Paul, thank you, brother, for being here. Appreciate you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Neil. It's been a pleasure.